Hey, this is Greg Anderson, and this is the Living in Carver County podcast. It's an insider's conversation with the people who make Carver County the best place to live, work, and raise a family. Now, my guest today, although he doesn't reside in Carver County, I think this topic is really apropos. My guest is David Sherman. David is the owner of Disability Consulting Solutions. And the way that David and I came to meet was that, indulge me on a story a little bit here. Sorry, David. It's on Halloween. I had an appointment during the day, and I met with this guy, and he obviously had diminished capacity. He was in a bad way. His home was in foreclosure. And I knew that I couldn't move ahead with him because he really just, from my amateur perspective, he didn't have the capacity to enter into any kind of valid agreements, even though he was clearly in need of it. And traditionally on Halloween, one of my previous guests, Michael Boylan, and his son Connor, they always come to our house on Halloween and help hand out candy. And my wife makes chili, and it's kind of an exclamation point on the season. And so I was kind of talking to Michael about the situation and how I was really torn up about what was going on with this guy. And he had recommended that I reach out to David. And I called you, David, and you came. And I think you gave probably one of the most eloquent segues to kind of meet this guy where he was and really sort of shape him into locking in and having a conversation. You identified a particular identity that he had that was very strong. And I mean, it was one of the more profound things I'd seen in an interaction. And it was so elegant and so effective, and it just kind of snapped him in. So at that point, David and I became really friendly because, and I just have been deferring to his expertise ever since. So I'm very excited to have you as a guest today, David, and thanks for agreeing to be on.
I appreciate it, Greg.
All right, so we're just going to get right into it. Now, you spent over 30 years working in the space of advocacy. What drew you into it originally, and has the heart of the work stayed the same, or has it kind of shifted for you?
Hmm. Yeah, back in the mid 80s, I had a very, very close friend of mine. We were both really into outdoor activities like hiking, canoeing, running, and we had a very, very deep, close relationship. We were more or less brothers, and he was a mentor to me. He was about 5 or 6 years older. And he was like a mentor, big brother to me. And I was very close with he and his wife. This is before they became parents. And one day we were running. It was about 5 mile run, and his legs just gave out, and he fell. And I literally had to drag him back to the vehicle, which was a few miles away, and he literally could not stand on his own 2 feet. And through a series of medical appointments the next few weeks, he was diagnosed with progressive MS.
Hmm.
And this was a man that was about 30 years old, early 30s. And it was a very, very long, arduous journey of him trying to maintain his marriage, his work life, his personal life. And, I walked very close with him through the journey. My wife and I moved to the Twin Cities back in 1991, but always made it a point to keep in touch with him. And when we went back to Canada to visit with my family, always made it a point to spend time with him. And, through the course of years, his wife left him with their new child, which was very sad. She just couldn't deal with it. And he just went through an immense struggles and challenges, both physically, cognitively, personally, financially, through the onset and progression of his MS. He eventually passed in 2001. And it was very, very difficult for me because I had walked so much of the journey. And again, I never had any type of exposure professionally or personally with disability ever, except with my friend. And it's funny, Greg, sometimes you sense a calling in your life. It's not something tangible. It's not something you can articulate. It's not something you can really explain rationally to people. It's just that real deep sense that this is what I'm called to do, is to be an advocate for those who cannot advocate for themselves. And my friend Ken could not advocate for himself after several years with the disease, just because it affected every part of his body eventually.
Right.
Um, so that's how I really changed my trajectory of life, both professionally and personally, back in the early 90s, when we moved here to the Twin Cities because of that experience with my friend Ken. And he was actually best man in our wedding too.
Oh, nice. And
Yeah.
how did you make that shift, or was it a shift, or how did your career kind of evolve in the early 90s?
Um, when we moved here, started networking and looking for, work, specifically working with folks with disabilities and chronic illnesses. And my background, my academic background is in psychology, so I had some semblance of various cognitive and physical deficits that people encounter. But obviously, what you learn in school is not very congruent with real life experiences. So it was a real learning curve for me. Started working in group homes with adults with developmental disabilities. Did that for several years, worked up my way up into supervisory and training role, where we're training and teaching new staff various behavioral uh, techniques, working with folks with disabilities, and did that for several years, and then moved into other areas, which I'll talk about as we proceed here with our conversation.
Okay. Well, it's kind of a nice segue into the next question. Your roles, have obviously shifted over the years, and so if you can kind of maybe just walk people through what it is you do today, and how that's kind of how you got going in that, and also then where some of the court appointed work fits into the overall picture.
Yeah, so over time, um, the whole world and journey of disability is very uncertain. Both with children and adults, when they're diagnosed with a specific diagnosis, a disability, whether it be cognitive or physical, you don't really know what the future holds. And for me, in the beginning of my career, every day was different. You have to have an open mind and an open heart, because there's so many unpredictables. And after working in group homes with many years, I really felt a need to um, transition into a different area of the industry. And I um, was employed with Opportunity Partners, and we had pioneered um, a office down in Richfield, working specifically with traumatic brain injury. And I was very, very fascinated with that population for many reasons, um, primarily because they pose so many different life challenges after sustaining their head injury. And it was just very rewarding and fulfilling for me, Greg, to at least be a um, encouragement and a support to them alongside their medical professional team as well. And through that, I was really, really burdened with the plight of their families and caregivers. And as you may well know, after you've earned the trust and credibility of the individual whom you're serving and supporting, but just as important, their family, they start to really open up to you. You've earned the trust, you've earned the credibility, and they realize that they feel safe with somebody who understands and who listens and who can empathize with their situation. And they started opening up to me about a lot of personal challenges and consequences of their own or their loved ones, disability, regarding strains on the marriage, strains on their parenting, challenges in relationships, their financial resources are depleting very quickly. Uh, Paying out of pocket what insurance doesn't pay, affecting their social life. So many different issues, Greg, that they just started to burden on me. And I realized that after being in the field for a couple of decades already, that um, county case managers, other folks who work in the field can only do so much and provide specific services and supports within their parameters. But there's a lot of gaps, and we'll talk about that a little as we proceed here. And that's what I started to discern with a lot of these families that really was a precipice for me getting into my own consulting business.
That makes a lot of sense. Like from a personal standpoint, when we were caring for my father-in-law, somebody always had to be with him. And so my wife and I never went anywhere. We kind of joke that we were like Peter Parker and Spider-Man, we're never in the same place at the same time. And after he passed, we realized that like we were sort of socially stunted as a couple going out. It was seemed so unfamiliar. And that was relatively short period of time, and how much it adjusts your equilibrium, just even just something as simple as just social interactions.
Yeah,
But so I'm going to kind of dig in a little bit more about what you do. So, like, for example, like I would have to imagine most people have never heard of disability consulting as a profession. And so when someone calls you for the very first time, what is it that they're usually trying to figure out, and kind of
yeah.
what's the shape of that type of conversation?
Excellent question. Yeah. So during the initial consultation, basically, it's the primary caregiver that reaches out. And it could be someone who has a spouse with a disability or chronic illness. It could be an adult with an elderly parent. Could be a parent of a minor or adult child with special needs, or it is that very person that's dealing with their disability. So basically, the initial phone call, they just talk, they just vent. I find it fascinating over the years that um, they have really reached out to me, not as a last resort, but just as another option many times, Greg,
Mhm.
because they have really entered a point right now, not so much of burnout, but of frustration, feeling overwhelmed, high levels of anxiety and stress. And they just need somebody to just vent on and listen.
Like, yeah, that makes
And
sense.
that really, I would say, is about 90 to 95% of the initial calls that I get. They're usually through referrals or through my website or through whatever means, and they just need somebody to listen and to understand and not say anything. So I have found that my role in initial consultation is just to listen for the first 15 or 20 minutes. It's really, that's common.
Sure.
And then they are looking for options. They share with me. I let them know that, we're here to just have an initial consultation. I'm just going to ask some open-ended questions, and then you feel free to talk and share. And I also let them know that everything we discuss is strictly confidential, that I share that with nobody unless they give me authorization to do so. and that we're going to then summarize what we've discussed, and then I would share, some options in terms of what direction we're going to proceed. So the nature of the consultation is really specific to that individual's the context of their situation. So I try to be very, very sensitive to the emotional component because I'd say almost 100% of the folks that call me are pretty high level on emotion because they're just so overwhelmed and frustrated. And I try to bring some calm and some hope and some direction for them by the end of our consultation, and that they
You've
don't
got,
give up.
yeah, you've got a real nice way about you in that respect to just very, easy to talk to. You talk about on your website, you talk about a personalized support plan. Walk us through what actually would go into one and, what it covers and what it does for a family in sort of
Yeah,
practical terms.
yeah, excellent. Well, just as a backdrop, Greg, like I shared, every family has their own different dynamic. In terms of the primary caregiver or caregivers, which would be parents or adults of elderly folks or a spouse of a veteran or just a spouse that's suffered any type of disability. They have one thing in common. They don't have any knowledge of what information or resources are out there. They lack support. They've been estranged. Many of them are estranged from family members and from former friends that they used to socialize with because now their whole world is completely upside down. But they also lack direction. There's a lot of uncertainty about the future. So the what I try to accomplish first is earning the trust and the credibility from the family. Because if they're going to share with me some very, very personal, intimate information about themselves, their loved one who they're caring for, they have to feel safe.
Mhm.
So, my goal, Greg, initially is to develop a rapport, a healthy rapport. Secondly, I gather as much information as I possibly can in terms of their financial status, uh, what healthcare insurance they have at the time, if any. Try to establish what a typical day is like. What are some of the cognitive challenges? What are some of the physical challenges? What are the ramifications of those? How it affects the individual, how it affects the family or the primary caregiver. We discuss what the future looks like, you know, in different scenarios. So there's many different factors and variables that weigh into really designing a comprehensive support plan that is person-centered,
Okay.
because there's no cookie cutter, there's no template for a personal support plan. We also take into consideration the caregiver aspect, which you're probably familiar with, is that how many hours a week can caregiving be devoted to their loved one? Are there trusted friends and family members whom you can have look after your loved ones so you can have some respite, some self care, some revitalization and rejuvenation to avoid or mitigate the risk of burnout, caregiver burnout? So we really focus on the caregiver as well, and to mitigate the risk of them burning out or not being able to provide the care and support that they've been accustomed to.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's sometimes I was likened it to Chinese water torture. You were just you could take it and take it, and there was just this point where you just kind of, you know, I remember coming home sometimes and I could just see by the look on my wife's face that she had kind of hit threshold and she just needed a bit of a reprieve. And so I'd be
Yeah,
like, all right, we're going for a drive, and I would take her,
yeah,
her father, and we'd plop in the car and go to Culver's and get something and drive around and, look at Christmas
Yeah.
lights or whatever, just
Yeah.
needed that little break so that you could get a reset.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And that brings me to, that's a very good point, Greg, because as you know, the primary caregiver is really carrying an immense burden, both mentally, physically, emotionally, by caring for their loved one. And especially if they don't have a spouse like you who's willing to take up the slack, if their family or friends are out of state and they can't be called upon. So many of them are really walking their journey of caregiving alone. They are isolated, they feel misunderstood, they feel marginalized. They can't work as much as they could before, so there's a real financial hit on them. They're just carrying an immense burden on them. And to have just somebody who can listen or can take up the slack or who can provide some of that caregiving, so the primary caregiver can have some just alone time and self-care, it mitigates the risk of them not only burning out, but not being able to provide the necessary and appropriate support and care for their loved one if they're depleted.
that's exactly it. Your glass is empty. You can't fill anybody else's glass. We had some friends who would bring meals over periodically. They just call and say, "I'm going to stop by." Um, Emron, Ellie, you guys you don't know how much that meant to us, where they just called and said,
Mm-hmm.
we're coming by and we're going to have dinner. And I mean, those people, I got to tell you, have such a high, is such an important place in our hearts because you
Yeah.
just, and it would, and, I think we have a benevolent God because those happened at times when you really needed it.
Oh,
So,
absolutely.
it was, those are
Yeah.
really important. David, you've written about how you mentioned, you kind of alluded to this. You've written about in your LinkedIn articles about how disability or serious illness often triggers a financial crisis. Like you said, you've got lost income, you've got depleted savings, housing instability. How often does the home itself become part of the equation, and what does that situation actually look like when you're called in?
So when you speak about the home, can you be a little more specific in terms of what context? Because there's different aspects of the home that are really affected. So what in
Well,
particular
like
are
when
you?
you're, if say in a spousal situation, for example, I mean, so much for somebody who's going through these kind of health challenges, the stability familiarity of place is such a grounding principle. And when the situation, are there people that call you where they're at a situation where that's becoming untenable because of the lost income and things
Oh, okay,
and
perfect. No, that's good. No, I understand. Um, there's different factors that weigh into how the home is affected. Relationally, you can only imagine it's pretty chaotic in terms of the onset or the progression of a disability or chronic illness of the individual, because now schedules are all have to be changed and modified. As I mentioned before, Greg, there have to be additional caregivers that need to be called upon as well for respite and relief. But in terms of the financial implications, depending on the size of the mortgage payments that need to be made and the other financial responsibilities in maintaining a home, really takes a hit because now there's a reduction in income. A family does not have any awareness of what governmental benefits they even are eligible or qualify for that could at least provide some financial relief for them.
Mhm.
And we'll get it. We're going to address that as well as the benefits. And third, um, the relational stress between a husband and wife or between other siblings becomes very, very intense as well. So, in that respect, from a relational and familial context, the home is affected. It's not just financial. So, they all are interconnected and interrelated.
Mhm.
It's like a domino effect. And I've been in situations, Greg, before where I've walked in as a third person neutral consultant with several family members in the home. And it's very fascinating just to see how um, I don't want to really use the word dysfunctional because I think in respect we're all dysfunctional to a certain degree, and especially when a major life event happens that we can't predict.
Hmm.
But there's just so many communication issues because everybody is experiencing this new event in a very, very different way. And I need to be sensitive to that and just listen and never judge anybody for reacting in a way. I'm there to bring peace, to bring unity, to get everybody on the same page so we can work together in a collaborative manner to really help their loved one either recover or promote their health and safety. But that also includes all the family members, primarily the caregiver, that their emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical health is also maintained as well. So that's how I see the home as being unified, as we progress on this journey together.
Well, and it's such a profoundly foundational aspect of someone that's that grounding effect, right? So whether, that
Correct. Yeah.
hierarchy of needs, that stability that if you in six
Yeah.
human needs psychology, it's that need for certainty, right? And so you've got, say, if you have a spouse and now your income's directly affected, well, you've got other family members in
Yeah.
addition to the primary care provider and all of their
Yeah.
um, sense of place, whether that's a house that they own or an apartment it doesn't matter,
Yeah.
wherever it is that they live, when that becomes at risk, that's a
Yeah.
significant challenge for everybody. Like to your point is that, and I thought interesting was a great way to say it, but and it's not really dysfunction. It's going to the core of their
Hmm.
sense of the safety that groundedness, so, yeah, I got to imagine that's a significant
Yeah.
set of dynamics that you
Yeah.
deal with.
And that reminds me of one other important, an important point, Greg, that I'd like to add is that the defining of roles is very different now.
I'm sure.
Immediate and extended family and friends all had certain roles before this major life event, whether it be an accident or a diagnosis or the progression of an illness. That's also a big transition as well,
Sure.
especially with the elderly community. Um, so now everybody's roles are very, very different. And as you know, with human nature, change is very difficult and challenging for a lot of people. So to
Well,
change
especially when it's the
roles,
change you don't want.
or
People
yes,
like
or
the
the
change
change,
of making more money. They're happy with that
yeah,
change, but the change they don't want, that's a whole
yeah,
nother ball game.
yeah.
So yeah,
And it's very, very interesting because as I've worked with families over the years, it's very, very interesting for me to observe how certain individuals will adapt and adjust very easily into those roles because they just know this has to be done. We got to see mom recover, or I got to see my husband get working again and providing for the family, or I got to see my special needs son, get the appropriate support and services he needs. So some folks will just adjust. They'll just say, okay, it's just got to be done, and they're very, very laser focused. And then I've observed other people, like you alluded to, who are very resistant to change. It's not their wheelhouse, it's not their gifting, it's very unfamiliar, they've never had to play that role before. So it's more of a slow and resistant transition into that role. And there's times, Greg, where I have to facilitate that and gently nudge without saying, well, if you don't fulfill this role and this doesn't get done, well, these are going to be the consequences and implications. So you really have to be able to understand how every family member, including the person with illness or disability, how are they perceiving the whole situation? What is their role? What are the roles that they're willing to take on? How can we work as a symphony here and work together to bring unity so that the loved one who's receiving all the cares and supports could really recover, or at least have the best quality of life they can possibly have? So that's really the goal, and it's a tightrope many times when you're
I have to
walking.
imagine. And then you when you think about, elderly people, for example, so many of the families are very, patriarchal in terms of the structure. Dad made the income, dad pays the bills, and all of a sudden, if that
Absolutely. Oh
ability is
yeah.
taken away,
Oh yeah.
yeah, the spouse is sort of
Yeah.
forced into something. In my day job, I deal with that quite often, where this person was the primary breadwinner. The other
Yeah.
person was kind of staying home, taking care of the kids, and the person handled all the financial
Mhm.
aspects and things. And
Mhm.
and is when that stops, that person either has to, it can easily go into overwhelm. Especially as you
Yeah.
get older, you don't adapt to change quite as readily as you
Yeah.
did maybe 20 years ago. So those dynamics have to be incredibly challenging for you, I would think.
Yeah, and I think especially in the area of sacrificing their independence, many elderly folks that I've worked with are still very mentally sharp. They're still aware of what's going on, but they're in the situation right now where they may be a fall risk, or they can't drive anymore. They lose their license, or they have to move into a long-term care facility because it's no longer safe for them to remain in their own home. And it is very, very difficult for especially elderly folk who have been independent, like you said, Greg, who have earned a living well, or who have been the matriarch or patriarch of the family and have run the family, and all of a sudden they have to give that up. It is very, very challenging for them um, to give up part or all of their independence right now and hand it off to other people. It's very humbling, and
Well, and identity
I
too. Not
empathize.
just
I
it's
empathize
and
with.
well, and it's their whole self-identity. I mean, their whole self-image is this is my role. This
Yes,
is what I
yes,
and so often roles and identity
yeah.
are kind of intertwined.
And that's
Um,
where the conflict happens, because when we're trying to establish new roles, a new norm in the family, and that could be just two people in the family or a whole host of siblings,
sure. Yeah.
it's very, very challenging to identify what each person's new role is going to be so that we can all work in unity and collaborate together to provide the health and safety for their loved ones. So yeah,
Well,
it's
and you're talking
challenging.
about the people who are fortunate enough to have family. We
Right. Many of them are estranged from their families, or they're just alone here because they live
right.
out of state, so they don't have anybody else. And that's again where you have to bring in some outside. Um,
Yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit.
sure.
Conservatorship and guardianship are words that most people feel maybe are over their heads. Can you demystify that a little bit? What is it? What is it actually? And when does it become necessary? And what does that
Mhm,
process kind of look like?
mhm.
Um, because there's a little bit more of a draconian solution. So,
Sure, sure. Well, as I mentioned to you before, Greg, is that many folks, especially with cognitive impairments, you know, have various levels of diminished capacity to make sound decisions, whether they be legal decisions, financial decisions, medical decisions. And depending on the degree of diminished capacity to make those decisions, um, if their situation is becoming more progressive and there's short-term or long-term memory deficits, or in the case of dementia or Alzheimer's, there's a lack of awareness of their vulnerability and how susceptible they are to exploit various forms of exploitation, or if they've made some very, very poor financial decisions that are directly related to their cognitive deficits, then a risk mitigation plan has to be put into place in terms of minimizing the risk of them further being exploited, or or self-neglect. In the case of the individual that you and I worked with, it was more self-neglect.
Hmm.
Um, so the short, the long end of it is here is that really a plan needs to be put in place where um, somebody has to petition the court for guardianship. It could be a family member, it could be a trusted friend, it could be a guardianship company, you know, who um, really is responsible for advocating for that individual and acting as a surrogate um, guardian in terms of making those important decisions that otherwise the individual could make on their own. Now, this does not exclude the fact that that person can still have some type of input into the decision, and that's a whole other topic on supported decision making. So we have to really establish, okay, how much can the individual really have some input into the decision? And there should
Sure.
be some to maintain their dignity and not take away those rights of making their own decisions. So they have to have some degree of input, and that just takes some discernment after a while.
Well, and you got to get the buy-in too, because they still have to function. My um, sister, and I'm sorry burdening you with my personal stories, but my sister, her husband's, my brother-in-law's parents, um, he's been sole care provider
Hmm.
for his mother.
Hmm.
And a year ago, they decided they were going to move her into a home, and she had a complete meltdown, like
Yeah.
just and they actually went back home, stayed home for another year, but now it's gotten to the point where because the struggle is the I know that I don't know. I think I know. Now I don't know that I don't know, right? It's sort of the opposite of
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so it took her to get to a place where she was more resigned to accept this new reality, where before she had enough of her wits about her to be defiant about or
Yeah.
to not want that as an alternative. So it was incredibly challenging
Right.
for them. So
Yeah, and I think too, also, if the individual has some buy-in in it or input into that decision, with the guardian, there you really have to explain to them clearly and concisely that there are certain ramifications and consequences to the decision, to either decision, to all the decisions. You have to really look at this from a lateral perspective, that if you choose to remain in your own home and you're a high fall risk, or you're eloping from the home, or you're turning on the stove and you've left it on all day, if you explain it that way, these are the risks, these are the potential um, consequences. If we transition into independent living with some staff there, or a nurse on hand or whatever, you're not going to forfeit your independence, but at least there'll be a safety net there. Or going into assisted living, or sometimes having to go into memory care because they need more. So really, I think really clearly explaining the various options and the consequences, or the outcomes of each option to the individual, at least brings a little bit more clarity, and then they're willing to be somewhat more cooperative.
sure, sure. David, you work with two pretty different populations that we've talked about, people navigating lifelong disabilities, families dealing with parent or loved ones who's aging and declining. Um, and those are kind of fundamentally different conversations, or are they rather different conversations, or is there, what's the common thread that you see between both of those scenarios?
Excellent question. Yeah, there are absolutely, there are differences, and we can address those later. But the common challenges that families face, and we've referred to this before, is that they lack support, They're going this on their own pretty well in most situations. And that could be a single parent as well, where they don't have a spouse or they don't have anybody in their family to really support them. So, lack of support, lack of knowledge. They don't know what benefits they may be eligible for, their loved one may be eligible for, or they may not know what other programs are out there, support groups, other
Mhm.
types of financial resources, grants. I mean, this just a complete, they're oblivious to really what's out there because they've never lived in this world before. They've never been in this
Right.
context. And then thirdly, a lack of direction. You know, there's no predictability of how a illness or disability is going to really end up in the long run. So those are the common things, just lacking support, lacking knowledge, and lacking direction, clarity of direction. What direction should they take?
Sure.
A second thing that's very, very common with all families, and we talked about this a little before, Greg, is just the confusion, feeling overwhelmed, feeling misunderstood, isolated, um, uh, new conflicts that arise within families that never existed before. And then a lot of times, unresolved conflicts that come to the surface too, now that the heat is up in a new situation. That is very common as well,
Oh,
that they have to deal with, as you know, in,
oh,
in
yeah.
both demographics.
Yeah, yeah. I have a client, they were with a power of attorney, and I had to go mediate a dispute that was clearly 60 years old. And they had to hug it out. So,
Yeah, it
uh,
takes time and patience. It really does.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. In one of your articles, you cited research that 90% of seniors really want to stay in their own home as they age. What does that wish, you know, what's the reality when that becomes no longer safe? And how do families sort of navigate that conversation without it turning into a kind of a battle of will?
Hmm. You know, there's really no pat answer for that because every family dynamic is different. So I'll preface by saying that the medical team is very, very important in arriving in that situation. So let's say the person has had some falls in their home, or they've eloped from their property, or there's other hazards in the home that they're just not aware of living independently. So if the primary care physician deems it necessary for the individual to move into a more structured and safe environment like independent care with a staffing or assisted living facility, then really that really trumps the person's decision there because they're a vulnerable adult. They're vulnerable to so many different um, um, variables now that are going to affect both their health and their safety. Um,
Kind of exponential risk.
well, yeah, exactly. So it's very, very important that one or more um, members of the medical team weigh in on this as well in terms of recommendations and so forth. And then a second thing is that it's really, really important for the family and the individual to be in unity in terms of what the best options are. And as I shared with you before, Greg, we really have to discuss what the consequences are of each action. Staying in their home, moving into assisted living, and if there's family, and I mean I'm currently working with a family right now where they've brought the mom in and she lives with them, and it's worked out really well, like a basement apartment, mother-in-law apartment.
Sure.
So if the family agrees to bring in one of the spouse's family members or what have you, elderly parent in particular, then if there's a mutual consensus and it's working out well, and the marriage is intact and the family's intact, and everything's working well, that's a great option too. In fact, it's more cost effective that way for obvious reasons than going
Mhm.
into a long-term care facility. So I think family discussions, and many of them have to be made first. There really has to be a weigh-in of all family members of which ones are really going to be there to participate and engage. Because if you've got just one family member who's taking on the whole burden, it's not going to happen. It's
Sure.
just not going to work.
That's a
Yeah,
great
so those
segue.
those are the major things that need to be taken into consideration.
Okay. Well, that's a great segue into the next question. And then when families finally call you, what's the thing that they most often wish they'd have done sooner, or or the opposite side of that is what's the mistake? What's a big mistake that a lot of times people have
Mm.
already made before they call you?
Well, there are several. It's really funny you mentioned that, and I've shared this with many people. I don't know what the percentage is, Greg, but a high percentage of people, after meeting with me and having that initial consultation, whether it's over the phone or Zoom or in person, so many people say, David, I wish I would have known about you 5 years ago. And then I ask, well, tell me why. And then they share with me the situation. And I've learned from those conversations, Greg, as to um, that they've procrastinated is one of them. They've procrastinated. Well, mom could stay at home longer, or we can support, our son at home longer, um, until we have to make a decision about maybe long term, like a group home or other facility. So a lot of it is procrastination, not in a negative way, though, it's in a positive way. And what I mean by that is that they've procrastinated in the hopes that their loved one is going to get better or improve. So they put these things off. And I can understand that because they have hope and, hey, we can just do this together. We're a team. We can have them live here longer. That's their wishes. That's their expressed wishes. So it's a positive type of procrastination, if you know what I mean by that.
Well, it's 80 years of muscle memory, right? Of that this is the way
Yeah,
it is. This
yeah,
is, and
right.
yeah, everybody's
And
role.
yeah, and a second thing is that um, it's very, very important to determine the individual's mental and physical health at the time. Does it really warrant them moving at this time, or is it something we can put off? And you can't predict that. So many families that I've spoken with, Greg, when they first called me, said, yeah, we should have moved them a year ago, but
Right. Yeah.
sometimes there's financial constraints. They can't afford to move them into another facility.
Yeah.
They just
Right.
don't have the financial means to do it. Um, I've also encountered many, many folks that I've worked with, Greg, who um, have been so overwhelmed and have really been doing this on their own. And a lot of it is single moms, single dads, or just one family member taking on the whole burden because the siblings, of an elderly parent live out of state.
Sure.
And it's just them taking it all on their own. They can't see the end of the tunnel. And they're just so overwhelmed. And I've met people that have actually said to me, quote, I don't even know that I'm burned out. I've been doing this for so long and making all the decisions and all the caregiving. I don't even know. I just keep going because I know I got to care for whoever. So I think the fact of being overwhelmed can really blind a person to just take a step back, to reach out to somebody and say, hey, I need help.
Sure.
Because they have been the primary catalyst in providing all the care for the person, making all the decisions, taking them to all the medical appointments, doing all the legal and financial work for their loved one, that they don't have time to look at their situation objectively. So there has been that, oh my goodness, I should have done this years ago, but I didn't see it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
I know. I get.
and we
I get
can't
it.
judge anybody. We can't judge them. Everybody's situation is very unique.
Yeah. I know as like in our personal situation, one of the exacerbating things too would be is you'd have somebody out of state, and you begrudge them for being out of state, but they would
Yep.
call and you have this sort of Minnesota conversation. How is it going? Good. How are you? Good. How's work? Good. How
Yeah.
you busy? And they're not having a substantive conversation. And then they would
Yeah.
go, well, Dad sounds fine. And it's like, ask what he had for breakfast. I mean,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
ask a
Yeah.
harder question. You're at this, we get at this, that sort of Minnesota nice where you're having this
Yeah.
conversation that's
Yeah.
not substantive, and you don't really, you don't understand the complexity of the
Mm.
situation, and I have that, other people have shared that experience with me too, when if you're the
Mhm.
primary character, you're seeing everything, and other people are getting kind of the
Yeah.
Instagram version of what's going on. So,
Yeah, and back to the point we were discussing earlier, Greg, is that, the person that's been living in their home for so long, it's very difficult for them to surrender all that independence and familiarity with their neighbors and their local stores and their neighborhood. They've been there for so long, and to surrender not only their independence, but the familiarity. There's so much resistance. So they've remained in their home longer than they really should have because they've just been battling the family. No, I'm staying. I'm not going anywhere.
well, and then the muscle memory too. I mean, they can walk through the
You
house
know.
with the lights off because they know where everything is. They've got these neural patterns that have just been ground in, and
Yes.
and when
Yes.
and so it's especially hard when that shifts. It's like, well, I don't know where the coffee table is now, where they could navigate through, and they certainly seem
Hmm.
better than they actually are when they're in a familiar environment.
Or they present better. They present
There you
better,
go.
but if you remove them from that environment
Exactly.
and they start discussing, well, how are you doing? It's a completely different story. And I've actually witnessed this myself as a guardian when I've been in a lot of these consultations with uh, various therapists and counselors and so forth, and neurologists, especially with neurologists. A person may present so well in their home, like you said, because they're so familiar with everything, and they know what you want to hear. They know what the doctors and everybody wants, and what the family wants to hear. But when they go through these neuropsychological tests and these other instruments in testing their cognitive ability and everything else like that, it's a very different story, which warrants them having to move into a long-term care facility. So that's a very good point you bring up, and that's very common.
Okay. I had an attorney on named Carl Tashia, and he specializes in elder care and estate planning and things. And he happens to be in our BNI group. It's a business
Oh, okay.
networking group. And
Yep.
his, you obviously have to have a little tagline, right? And his is "Don't wait until it's too late." From where you sit, what does waiting actually cost people? Not just in dollars,
Hmm.
but also in terms of the options that all of a sudden are no longer on the table.
Great question. Well, first of all, um, I think one of the primary implications of waiting too long is that personal savings run out. And I just worked with a family where this happened, is that their savings are being depleted very, very quickly. And because of that, if they're already in a long-term care facility and their savings are depleting quickly, then they or the family member can't afford to have them living there anymore. They've waited too long. Whereas if they had made the decision to apply for medical assistance and or waiver program or Social Security disability before, this would have alleviated and mitigated the risk of them depleting all of their savings and not having to make a knee-jerk reaction based on emotions. So that's happens more than I really imagined because I've worked with families like that. I'm currently working with one like that, and it's like you really have to negotiate with the facility. You have to consult with their financial planner. Okay, do we have to, and then with an elder law attorney, okay, do we put everything in a special needs trust or whatever, depending on the age of the person? So then you're just scrambling for options rather than having a very carefully laid out design plan ahead of time to mitigate that risk. So that's one of the biggest hits. So then they're not going to receive the cares and services that they are accustomed to receiving, as well as the financial hit. A second thing, the cost of waiting, is that that person's mental and or physical situation has declined even more. So now they're going to need a lot more cares and services because they cannot perform their activities of daily living independently anymore. Well, how's that going to happen? It takes quite a while. It's quite a long process to be approved for medical assistance and waiver programs for it to even kick in.
And then the availability. I mean, you might not be able to find something that has
Yeah.
any sort of anything resembling convenience for the family members because it becomes if you get to a point where where you've waited to where you have to move, now you're going to have to take whatever's available, and that may be, an hour
Yeah.
away.
Yeah.
So
That and I think also that the caregiver as well, the primary caregiver, um, sometimes, and I've seen this before, they get to a point where it's kind of like brain freeze. They just can't make the decisions anymore on behalf of their loved one.
sure,
So that's when they call me. David, can you
decision
help us out?
fatigue.
We made or I've also had families, yeah, or they just they can't do it anymore. They just do not know what their options are, and they're looking to me to navigate the whole thing for them. That's a challenge because I have to have the cooperation of many people, but yeah, we can do it. Um, I think one other thing you just reminded me of, Greg, is that many folks have tried applying for Social Security or medical assistance on their own without any help, without any guidance, without any support. Some of some of them have succeeded. It's just taken longer because they weren't even aware of the process, and it's multi-step process. They weren't aware of how long it was going to take, or many of them just didn't finish it correctly, or they didn't do it, and then the application was null and void. So many of them have tried doing it on their own, where it just didn't succeed. So they need somebody who's not only going to advocate for them, but who's going to facilitate um, the entire application process, and really cause it to go through much smoother without any hiccups.
Okay. For an adult child who's watching a parent who's just starting to struggle and they're starting to sense that maybe something's a little bit off and they're not sure what to do with that feeling there, that sort of um, impetus that they're getting. What's the early warning system that you'd want them to have? Like when should the alarm go off?
I think first of all, when they objectively see their loved one declining in certain areas, or they're just not the same person anymore. They're just they can tell a lot of these physical or cognitive differences, in their loved one. So when they see some changes, I think consulting with the primary care um, doctor or other physicians involved, other medical professionals involved, consulting with them as well, and looking at the case notes, maybe some retesting or whatever, to see what type of declines. I think also, I think caregivers and their families also need to look themselves in the mirror and really evaluate. Okay, can we do this anymore? Can we take on this burden on our own anymore? Do we need outside help, or do we need to place mom and dad somewhere?
Let's go upstream from that, if you will. So, say you've got a parent that's functioning and you're starting to notice things. But I mean, you mentioned talking to care provider, but with the HIPAA privacy issues, how do you sort of bridge that when you feel like you're very early in the process? I mean, what would be a strategy for that when somebody starts to notice something, but
Okay,
they're kind of
I understand.
upstream from being needing a care provider?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the family members should definitely petition to become power of attorney and making both financial and medical decisions.
Okay.
Absolutely. So if the individual, is making their own decisions, then I think one of the family members should petition to become power of attorney to make those decisions, especially if there's cognitive diminishment in the person. Um, I think if they notice that um, the person is falling more, or if they're doing something in their home that is potentially dangerous and harmful that can jeopardize their health and safety. If now, many times, Greg, the adult, the elderly parent or parents are living on their own without their caregiver families living there. That's a challenge because now that one person has to visit more often, has to monitor their situation, has to do a lot more. So I think that's even more intensive because they're not there every day to observe mom and dad's or mom or dad's, situation. So that takes more diligence and more, I think, intentionality in terms of overseeing how mom and or dad are doing in their own home here.
Yeah, I have somebody that I know, and the husband had passed away a number of years ago, and the wife is living in the home, and I know the daughter lives out of town, and she's basically got ring cameras all over the house, so she's kind of
Mm-hmm.
monitoring it.
Mm-hmm.
It's got a kind of a weird kind of dynamic to it, but there's cameras all over, sort of monitoring it because
Mm-hmm.
she clearly the mom clearly wants to stay in the property, and the daughter's trying her best to, and she's coming up once a week, and she
Mm-hmm.
lives about a couple hours away, and so she's coming up once a week, but she's trying to, she spends a lot of time on the computer, and it just has there's just an odd dynamic with that, but. Let's talk about some practical takeaways. Your tagline is transforming uncertainty into peace of mind. What does that look like when it happens? And can you maybe talk about the shift that a family would feel when they do get a plan in place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's it's very interesting some of the comments I get from families, both personally or in a written note or an email after um, they or their loved one has been approved for medical assistance or waiver programs or social security disability, or we've already, had a support plan and risk mitigation plan already put into place. Um, they have a sense of relief. That is the biggest thing, a sense of relief. The burden has been either lifted or reduced significantly in that person's life. And again, many of these families have taken me into their confidence, so they really open up to me, especially at the end of our few months together or whatever. They're just so grateful because they yeah, it's pretty overwhelming for me too because I don't even realize the emotional impact I'm having on families. I'm just doing my job and helping them navigate and coming alongside and holding their hand and just doing what I do. But when I get those type of comments or letters or emails, it's very gratifying. I because you realize that okay, we we did accomplish many objectives for mom or dad or for your son or daughter or husband or your veteran loved one or whoever. We did do all that, but for the caregiver, it's just as significant, Greg, because now they have that burden lifted off them, and they're not. They can finally have the luxury of providing self care, more respite time, not having the burden of dealing with the state or the county or all the other different professionals that they've been collaborating with, and mom and dad or their loved one, they're now in a safe place. Or if they're living at home, at least we've got a plan. At least we've so now they have more support. They have greater knowledge, more broader knowledge, and they have more clarity of direction. So what they were lacking before at the onset of the journey now has been fulfilled. And most importantly, they now have hope. And that's what I try to do is provide hope and peace of mind to these families initially when it's chaotic because now, and you can see it. I mean, you can see it just in their tone of voice and their countenance and how they relate to you. They're more calm. They're more at ease. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
it's
that's
very gratifying for everybody. It's yeah.
yeah, that's very cool. If someone's listening right now and they're sitting with that uncertainty that you were talking about, a parent, a sibling, maybe themselves, what's the single most concrete step you'd want them to take immediately?
Well, I think most importantly at the beginning is to really, and I know it's difficult, it's challenging, but to
Okay.
step back objectively, and on your laptop or with a pen and paper, saying, what are the most pertinent challenges that I am facing right now as a caregiver, or we as a family? What are we facing? Getting it down on paper is so key because it's all floating around in their minds. It's just all, it's scrambled. They can't really define what the challenges are. But when you get it down on paper and you have a family discussion, or if you're just a sole caregiver, stepping back and doing that, and then give me a call. You know, you can give me a call and reach out to me. I provide a free 30-minute consultation. There's no financial obligation, everything's confidential. There's no obligation to move on or proceed at all. I'm just here to kind of help you navigate what the next steps are and give clarity of direction. And at least that's a starting point. You're getting out of the starting block rather than just being stagnant, doing nothing for all these years and just burning out or becoming more frustrated and anxious. So at least, you know, a starting point would be good to see, okay, well, what are some of the options moving forward?
Okay, well, we'll put your contact information, your website in the show notes for the YouTube and for the on the podcast, so people will be able to
Sure.
easily find you. David, is there anything else that you want to leave as sort of a parting thought before we wrap up? I appreciate all your time, by the way. We've gone a little bit over, but this has
Yeah.
been incredible.
Yeah, the one thing that I would want to encourage your listeners, Greg, is to realize that there is hope. That it may seem hopeless now, may seem very overwhelming, your situation, no matter how many days, weeks, years you've been undergoing this, either on your own or as a family unit. But there is hope, and there are options, and there are resolutions to certain challenges that you're facing. Um, the challenge is that you know people have to take that step and look outward and say, okay, what are the best scenarios for my loved one here? What are the best scenarios for our family? And then explore those options rather than just waiting until it's too late.
Okay. All right, David, thank you. This has been amazing. I really appreciate your time, your wisdom, and your the generosity of your spirit. It's very inspiring.
Well, I
Well,
appreciate the privilege of you having me on your podcast, Greg. This has been wonderful.
all right, I'm going to stop recording, but this has been fantastic. Thank you.